She was whipped in public for being infertile, while the whole town watched in silence. The wind howled, the church bell tolled, and the crack of the whip echoed through the snow-covered street. No one dared to stop it, until a shadow on horseback rode through the storm. They called him the feared mountain man, half legend, half ghost. No mercy in his eyes, only fire. When he cut her loose and carried her into the wilderness, the town whispered that the devil himself had come for her. But deep in those frozen peaks, something far more dangerous was waiting. Secrets buried beneath church walls, a stolen spring, and a preacher who'd do anything to keep his sins hidden. As the snow melts and truth rises, mercy becomes the fiercest weapon of all. Will this mountain man's return bring redemption, or start a reckoning that burns the whole town down? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. Snow drifted through the mountain wind like torn lace as the people of Jericho Crossing gathered in front of the clapboard church. The morning sun hung weak behind the clouds, and the bell tolled slow and cold. Men stamped their boots to keep warm. Women clutched shawls around their shoulders. No one spoke much. All waited for the same dreadful thing. At the center of the street, tied to the tall post beside the church steps, stood a young woman in a faded calico dress. Her dark hair had come loose from its braid, and blood from a split lip stained the snow at her feet. Her name was Hannah McRae, though some in town had begun to call her the Barren One. They said it like it was a curse. Her husband, Earl, stood among the crowd, hat pulled low. He didn't look up when the Reverend raised a hand for silence. "Neighbors," called Reverend Cyrus Tomlin, voice loud as thunder and smooth as oil, "sin festers where the Lord's law is ignored. The Almighty said, 'Be fruitful and multiply.' But this woman, in her pride, has turned her back on that command. She mocks the blessings of womanhood. She has sown rebellion in her own home." Murmurs rolled through the gathered folk. A few men nodded. A few looked at their boots. Hannah stood still, lips pressed tight. She wanted to cry out that she hadn't turned from the Lord, that she had prayed every night for a child, but she knew it wouldn't matter. The Reverend's words were law here. 10 lashes, the Reverend said solemnly, that her spirit may be purified. The sheriff hesitated, glancing at Earl. Earl gave a weak nod. The sheriff swallowed hard, took the whip, and stepped forward. Hannah closed her eyes. The wind hissed through the street. Somewhere a church door creaked. The first strike cracked like a gunshot. She gasped but didn't scream. A second lash tore across her back. Her knees buckled and she tasted blood in her mouth. A third lash fell, and then another. "Enough!" shouted a voice. The whip froze mid-air. Every head turned. Down the snow-covered street, a black horse approached, steam rolling from its nostrils. The rider was a large man with a long coat and a rifle slung across his saddle. His face was shadowed by the brim of his hat, but his eyes burned through the storm. "Who dares interrupt the Lord's justice?" Reverend Tomlin demanded. The stranger didn't answer. He dismounted, heavy boots sinking in the snow, and walked straight toward the post. People stepped aside without meaning to. The man moved with quiet power, like he'd seen too much and feared nothing. He stopped beside Hannah. For a long moment he just looked at her, at the welts on her back, at the tremor in her hands. Then, without a word, he drew a knife from his belt and cut the ropes. Hannah slumped forward. The man caught her easily and turned to face the stunned crowd. "She's had enough," he said, voice low as thunder. "You ought to be ashamed." "Who are you to interfere?" the Reverend barked. "This woman's sin is between her and the Lord." The man's gaze lifted. Then maybe you ought to let the Lord handle it." No one moved. The wind blew harder. A few townsmen looked away, uneasy. Reverend Tomlin stepped back, but his pride wouldn't let him yield. "You'll answer for this," he shouted. "You think yourself above God's will?" The stranger didn't reply. He lifted Hannah into his arms. She weighed little more than a child, and carried her toward his horse. A boy whispered, "It's him, the mountain man from Silver Peak." The name spread like fire through the crowd. The beast of Silver Peak. Some said he'd killed soldiers in the war with his bare hands. Some said he lived alone with wolves. No one knew the truth, and none dared find out. He swung into the saddle. Hannah held tight against his chest and turned the horse toward the northern trail. The people parted silently. Snowflakes swirled through the hoofprints he left behind. By the time the horse reached the pine line, the sound of the church bell had faded. Hannah stirred weakly, her head against the stranger's chest. She tried to speak, but her lips were cracked and bleeding. "Easy now," he muttered. "You're safe." "Why?" she managed. "Why'd you—" "Because no one else would," he said. They rode through deep snow for hours. The wind bit their faces. The trees creaked under frost. When the path narrowed, he dismounted and led the horse on foot, careful not to jostle her. By dusk, they reached a hollow between cliffs, where smoke curled from a chimney half buried in snow. The man pushed open the cabin door with his shoulder and carried her inside. Warmth and lamplight wrapped around them. He laid her on a cot near the fire. "You got a name?" he asked. "Hannah," she whispered. He nodded once. "Gideon." She blinked, remembering that name from somewhere. A story, whispered by children who feared the woods. But his eyes, though hard, carried sorrow rather than cruelty. He stoked the fire higher and poured whiskey over her wounds. She hissed in pain. "Sorry," he said softly. "It'll keep rot off." When she fell asleep, he sat at the table, staring into the flames. Outside, the wind moaned like a restless spirit. Inside, for the first time in years, Gideon Holt prayed. Not for himself, but for the woman fate had thrown across his path. Morning came cold and gray. Hannah woke to the smell of broth and the sight of her torn dress folded neatly by the hearth. Gideon handed her a bowl and said, "Eat slow." She did, though her hands shook. When she finished, she looked around the cabin. Everything was simple. Handmade table, a Bible on the shelf, a rifle on pegs above the door. "Why'd you help me?" she asked again. He didn't look up from the fire. "Ain't right what they did. Don't matter the reason. You don't even know me." "Didn't have to." She studied him quietly. His beard was grizzled, his coat patched with years of wear. There were scars across his knuckles and a burn mark on his left cheek. Yet his movements were careful, almost gentle. "People said you were dangerous," she said. He gave a short laugh. "People say what they're told." She nodded. Silence hung between them, broken only by the crackle of the fire. That night, when Gideon thought she slept, Hannah whispered into the darkness, "Lord, I don't understand why you spared me, but if this man is lost, show me how to help him." Her voice was faint but steady. The mountain outside answered with a long sigh of wind. At dawn, Gideon saddled his horse. "Going to check traps," he said. "Stay inside. Wolves'll nose around if they smell blood." She nodded, pulling his quilt around her shoulders. After he left, she found her courage and stepped to the doorway. The forest beyond was white and still, the air so clear it almost hurt to breathe. For the first time in months, she felt something like peace. Far below, in Jericho Crossing, Reverend Tomlin stood before the church window, staring at the trail that led north. "Find him," he ordered Earl and 2 hired riders, "and bring the woman back, alive." "Yes, Reverend," Earl said, though his hands trembled. Tomlin turned back to his desk where a locked drawer hid a stack of papers, one of them bearing Hannah's father's signature and a faded stamp from the Territorial Water Office. He ran a finger over it, eyes cold as ice. "No one steals from the Lord," he muttered, though he meant himself. By evening, Gideon returned with fresh meat and snow on his shoulders. Hannah helped him hang the venison by the door. "I used to help my father with this," she said softly. "Your father a rancher?" "Owned land by the river, before the Reverend took it." Gideon paused. "Took it how?" She hesitated, then reached for the torn satchel she'd carried all this time. From it she drew a folded paper, sealed but stained with dirt. "This says the water rights pass to me if I bear a child. The Reverend drew it up when I married. But when I couldn't, he said it was void." Gideon studied the signature and the official seal. "Ain't void. This here's legal." "He burned the copy my father kept. Said it was God's will." Gideon's jaw tightened. "God don't steal water from widows." Hannah blinked, surprised by his anger. He folded the paper carefully and set it on the table. "Rest," he said. "We'll talk more tomorrow." As the lamp dimmed, Hannah lay awake, wondering what kind of man risked his life for a stranger, and why she felt safer with him than she ever had with her own husband. Outside, the snow fell thick and silent, covering the tracks that led from Jericho Crossing. But in the mountains, under the hum of the fire, 2 broken souls had begun the slow work of healing. Snow kept falling through the night, soft and steady, until the world outside turned to white silence. The cabin walls creaked in the cold. The fire burned low and steady, giving off the clean smell of split pine. Hannah woke before dawn, sore and stiff, but warm under Gideon's quilt. She watched the orange coals breathe and listened to the wind push against the chinked logs. Her back throbbed where the whip had cut skin. Every breath pulled at the sting, yet the pain told her she was alive. She whispered a prayer of thanks. Gideon stirred in the chair by the hearth. He had slept sitting up, boots on, coat thrown over his chest, rifle across his knees. When he saw her eyes open, he stood and stretched, joints popping. "How's the pain?" "It burns," Hannah said, voice small, "but I can bear it." He poured hot water from a kettle and set a pewter mug in her hands. The steam smelled faintly of willow bark. "Drink. It'll help. I'll change the dressings once the light's up." She sipped. The warmth spread through her belly and eased the ache in her head. Outside, a gray strip widened at the edge of the window. Dawn came late in winter here. Gideon lifted the Bible from the shelf, brushed dust from the cover, and set it at the end of the bed. He did not open it. "You asked last night why I helped," he said. "I reckon this book had a say, even if I ain't been much for reading it lately." Hannah held his gaze. "Thank you," she said. "For the book, and for my life." He nodded, like thanks made him uneasy, and pulled a small wooden chest from under the cot. Inside lay clean strips of linen, a small needle, and a tin of salve that smelled of bear fat and spruce. He dampened cloth in warm water. "Turn a little, if you can. I'll be careful." She lowered her eyes and turned her shoulder. His hands were large and rough, but they moved with slow care, lifting the old cloth, washing away dried blood, laying fresh salve. He did not say a word while he worked. When he finished, he tied the bandage firm, not tight. "There," he said, and stepped back. "Much obliged," she whispered. He set a pan over the fire, and fried thin slices of venison with a pinch of salt. Grease hissed. The smell filled the little room. He tore 2 pieces of yesterday's cornbread and warmed them on a flat stone, then handed her the plate and sat on the floor near the fire to eat his share. For several minutes they ate in quiet, only the pop of sap breaking the hush. When Hannah was done, she folded her hands and bowed her head. "Thank you for food and shelter," she prayed, "and for mercy shown to the weak." The simple words seemed to ease something in the room. Gideon's shoulders loosened. "I'll stable the horse," he said after a time. "There's a lean-to out back. If wolves come close, don't open the door. They don't want people, just the smell. But fear makes foolish things." She nodded. He pulled on his coat and hat, lifted the latch, and stepped into the cold. The door answered with a slow groan. Snow swirled in, nipped at the floor, and was gone when the door shut. Left alone, Hannah studied the cabin. The logs were tight. Moss and mud filled the chinks. A row of iron traps hung beside the door. A rack of drying fish lay above the fire, pale and thin as parchment. She saw a pair of moccasins by the bed, hand-sewn from soft buckskin, and beside them a pair of heavy boots, cracked but well-oiled. A flintlock hung under the rifle on wooden pegs. The place was made for one man to live, not to welcome guests, yet everything was neat, tools put away, boots lined up, knives wiped clean. She stood slowly, testing her legs. The room spun for a breath, then steadied. She took 2 careful steps to the shelf and touched the Bible's spine. The leather felt dry and cold. She opened to the middle. A pressed wildflower lay flat on the page like a whisper from years gone. Psalm words rose. "He healeth the broken in heart, and bindeth up their wounds." She swallowed. The verse felt like warm sunlight under her ribs. The door opened. Gideon came in with a swirl of frost in his beard. "Horse is set," he said, and stomped the snow from his boots. "Storm's easing. I'll run a line to the spring for water before it drifts over." He fetched a coil of rope and a wooden bucket from a peg, tied one end to the door frame, and wrapped the rope twice around his gloved hand. "If I don't come back in a spell, I'm lost in a drift. Don't come after me. I'll find the rope." He said it plain, like a fact, then stepped out again. Hannah stood by the fire and waited. The wind moaned, rose, fell. Once she thought she heard a far-off howl, thin as a saw blade. She pictured Gideon's broad back pushing into the white, his hand on the rope. Minutes passed. The latch clicked. He stepped back inside, bucket full, rope frosted. "Spring still runs," he said. "Thank the Lord. For groundwater and rock." He shook the rope, rewound it, and set it away. Then he filled the iron pot and propped it over the flame. The long morning wore on. Gideon repaired a trap with a broken jaw, eyes narrowed, hands patient. Hannah mended a tear in her sleeve, with a small bone needle she found tucked in a cotton roll. Her fingers moved slowly at first, then steadied. When the thread knotted, she looked up and found Gideon watching her. "You sew neat," he said. "My mother taught me. She used to say a straight seam makes a calm mind." He grunted softly. "Reckon there's truth there?" By noon, the storm had settled into a fine sift. Gideon wrapped a scarf around his neck and lifted a pack. "I'll check the traps close by. Not far. You'll hear 1 shot if I need help. 2 shots if I'm in trouble." "In trouble?" she asked, eyebrows rising. "Cat, most likely," he said. "Or a bull elk that don't like my face. Don't fret. I'll keep it to 1 shot if I can." She smiled before she could stop herself. "Please come back." His face softened, the barest flicker, and he tipped his hat brim. "I aim to." He vanished into the trees, leaving a brief whirl of snow. Hannah stood still a long moment, listening to the quiet he left behind. Then she put a little more wood on the fire and set herself to sweeping the hearth with a twig broom. The small work calmed her. She wiped the table with a damp cloth, rinsed the plates, folded the spare quilt, and straightened the tin cups on the shelf. She did not do it to pay him back. She did it because a straight room made a steady heart, and she needed a steady heart today. An hour later, a rifle cracked once, far to the east. She flinched, then breathed. One shot meant need, not harm. She stoked the fire higher so he would see smoke and know where home was. He returned a little before mid-afternoon, a bundle of snowshoe hair tied at his belt, and a gray shadow of weariness under his eyes. "Set 3 traps," he said. 2 sprung empty, 1 rabbit, scare tracks around the line, cat sure as sunrise. Hannah took the hares and carried them to the door. "I can dress them," she offered, then paused, glancing down at the bandage on her back. He shook his head. "Not with your back, I'll see to it." He knelt on a block by the doorway, pulled out his knife, and worked with quiet skill, keeping the pelts clean, the meat tidy, the floor swept of stray fur. Hannah heated water, added a pinch of sage she found in a small jar, and sliced a sliver of salt pork from a wrapped piece at the back of the shelf. A simple stew began to breathe in the pot. "Smells like Sunday," Gideon said. "It will taste like Tuesday," she answered, and the joke, small as it was, made his mouth pull to one side. She had not seen him truly smile, but she felt one was living in him somewhere, biding its time. As the stew simmered, the wind died. Afternoon light slid across the floor, thin and clean. Gideon sat with his back against the door and polished the rifle. He ran a cloth down the barrel, slow and even, like a man wiping old sins from his soul. Hannah ladled stew into 2 bowls and carried one to him, careful with her steps. They ate. Between spoonfuls, he said, "You got folks?" "My father's gone," she said. "My mother passed when I was a girl. I had a husband." She stopped there. He nodded like he knew the rest. "You can stay here till you're healed," he said. "No talk needed of after. We'll let the road choose when the weather turns." Hannah swallowed. "Thank you. I don't mean to trouble you." "You ain't trouble." He set his empty bowl aside. "Trouble's folks who know better and keep quiet." The sentence lay between them, heavy as a stone. She knew he meant the town. He might also mean himself. That evening, the sky cleared. A thin moon climbed the ridge, and the world glittered like glass. The wolves sang somewhere high, not close. Gideon banked the fire, checked the rifle caps, and laid a second quilt across Hannah's legs. "Sleep. I'll take first watch." "You need rest too," she said. He shrugged. "Been sleeping with one eye open since Shiloh." She did not know the word, but she knew it meant war. She wanted to ask more. She did not. She folded her hands under her cheek and let the warmth lift her toward sleep. Sometime after midnight, a dream seized her. She stood again at the post in Jericho Crossing. The whip cracked, but when she looked up, it was no longer the sheriff holding the lash. It was a small Apache boy, eyes huge and hurt, and behind him stacked the bodies of women, and somewhere a soldier's shout tore the sky. She saw smoke pouring from a camp. She smelled burned corn and horsehair. She woke with a strangled cry. Gideon was there at once, his hand raised but not touching. "Easy," he said. "You're safe. It's the dark playing tricks." She pressed a hand to her mouth, breathing fast. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to wake you." "Don't be sorry for what you can't help." He hesitated. "You said Apache?" She nodded, eyes wet. "I tried to save a sick boy once. Gave him water and willow tea. Soldiers came. I hid him under a blanket, but it didn't matter. He died 2 days later." She stared into the ash glow. "I never stopped hearing him cough." Gideon's face changed, not with anger, but with a deep old ache. "There was a raid," he said, voice slow and low. "Long time back. We were told it was a war party. It wasn't. I was a scout then. I led them in." He swallowed. "I hear coughing, too." Silence pressed in. The wind pushed a soft whistle through a crack somewhere in the wall. The coals glowed like small hearts. "I don't blame you," Hannah said after a time, though the words hurt to say. "I blame the lies that sent you, and the hardness in men who wanted land and water and power." He shut his eyes for a moment and opened them again. "You're kinder than most," he said. "I'm trying to be like the Lord I pray to," she answered. "I fail plenty." He sat back on his heels, staring at the flames. "I ain't prayed in years. Felt like if God heard me, he'd turn his face away." "Maybe he didn't," she said softly. "Maybe he sent you to cut me loose." He looked at her, and for a heartbeat, pain and wonder crossed his features like clouds moving over a peak. "Maybe," he said. They did not speak more. He settled again in the chair, watching the door while she folded into sleep, this time without dreams. Morning came clear and bright. The storm had wrung itself dry. Icicles hung from the eaves like glass knives and dropped, one by one, as the sun warmed the logs. Gideon stepped out to fetch more wood. Hannah sat up slow, stretched, and felt the bandage pull less. She stood and made the bed, then set the kettle to boil. When he returned, arms crowded with split rounds, she met him at the threshold. "Let me help," she said. "With what back?" "With what hands?" she answered, reaching to take a smaller log. He hesitated, then gave it over. She stacked each piece near the hearth, ends even. He watched, ready to step in if she winced. She did not. After breakfast, cornmeal mush with a spoon of honey from a comb sealed in wax, Gideon laid out a plan. "We'll make this cabin safer," he said. "Cats prowling. I'll set 2 new traps on the ridge. You can sit by the door with the shotgun. If you see shadow close, you shout. Don't fire unless you have to. The kick will hurt your back." "I understand," she said. He showed her the shotgun's action and how to set the cap. He had her practice lifting it to her shoulder, aiming at a knot on the far wall, and easing it down. She did it 3 times. Slow. Careful. Her cheek settled against the stock like it belonged there. "You learn quick," he said. "My father taught me to shoot a little," she said. "Only at bottles. He said a woman should know how to keep coyotes honest." "Smart man," Gideon said. His eyes softened, then cleared. "I'll be 2 hours. If I'm longer, it means I'm tracking. Keep the fire up. Eat if you need. Holler if you don't feel steady." She nodded. He took snares, traps, and a length of rawhide, put on his snowshoes, and stepped into the bright day. His shadow moved across the snow like a black sail, then folded into the trees. The 2 hours passed, not quick, not slow. Hannah read a psalm aloud, quiet and steady. She tidied the shelf where the cups sat. She trimmed a lamp wick and wiped the chimney glass till it shone. She whispered thanks that her hands still worked and asked for courage to fill the spaces fear had emptied. When Gideon returned, he carried spruce boughs and a strip of cured elk. He felt warmer somehow, as if the sun had touched him. "Tracks, say the cat. Moved off toward the saddle," he said. "We'll have night quiet for a spell." He spread the boughs by the door as a wind screen and set the elk strip on a peg beyond the reach of scavengers. Then he washed his hands in snow and came inside. "Smells like coffee," he said. "It's weak," she answered with a small smile. "But it's hot." They sat and drank from tin cups, steam fogging the rim. The world outside sparkled. Inside, the cabin felt less like a hiding place and more like a small, solid world with room for two souls trying to mend. Near evening, the clouds gathered again, thin and high. The light turned the color of pewter. Hannah stood at the hearth, spoon in hand, watching the stew bubble. "You've given me shelter," she said. "Let me give you supper." "You already did," he said. "I mean more than that." She turned the spoon. "Let me cook for us. Let me sweep. Let me mend what's torn. I can't swing an axe yet, but I can make home feel like home." Gideon looked around the neat space, the wiped table, the even stack of wood, the bright glass on the lamp, the Bible now resting open, a strip of wildflower pressing a psalm. His chest lifted. He nodded once. "All right," he said quietly. "We'll do this together." They ate in easy silence. After Gideon took his place by the door, whittling a peg for a future shelf, Hannah washed pots, hung the cloth to dry, and set 2 bowls upside down to keep off the dust. She smoothed the quilt and adjusted the pillow. The small, steady tasks stitched the day closed like a seam. Before sleeping, she spoke a short prayer. "Thank you for mercy new as snow. Watch over the man who cut me free." When she opened her eyes, Gideon was still as a carved post, but his mouth had the shape of thanks on it. He banked the fire. She lay down. The cabin sank into the soft hush of night. Far off, a coyote yipped. Another answered. Then quiet returned. The mountain, white and patient, stood watch above them. Hannah's last thought before sleep took her was simple and sure. She had not been rescued from death for nothing. She had been rescued for life. And life, even in a one-room cabin of rough logs, could be built one careful act at a time. Morning light filtered through the frost-rimmed window, falling across the cabin floor in long golden bars. The storm had passed in the night, leaving a world washed clean and quiet. Gideon was already outside splitting wood when Hannah stirred from sleep. Each thud of his axe rang steady as a clock, measured and sure. She listened, hands clasped beneath her chin, feeling safer than she had in months. When she rose, the ache in her back reminded her of where she had been. The bandages Gideon tied the day before had held. The wounds had begun to dry. She dressed slowly, pulled on her patched skirt, and stepped to the door. The cold bit her lungs, but the air was sweet. Gideon glanced over his shoulder and nodded without, stopping the rhythm of his work. "Mornin'. Fire's dying down. Poke it up if you get chilled." "I will," she said. The sound of her voice surprised her. It didn't tremble. Inside, she poured water from the kettle into a tin basin, washed her face, and smoothed her hair with a wooden comb. For a moment she saw herself in the small scrap of mirror hung by the door, pale, tired, and not quite the woman she remembered. Still, there was life behind her eyes again. Gideon came in with a load of logs balanced on his arm. "Suppose we'll need another day before the trail clears," he said. "I'll hunt closer to the ridge. You'll be all right here?" "Yes," she said. "I'm stronger today." "Good. I'll be back before dark." He hesitated, as if weighing whether to say more. "If something happens, if riders come, you take my horse. Follow the creek north till you see a burned cottonwood. There's a cave behind it. You'll be safe there." "Riders?" she repeated. He shrugged. "Folks don't take kindly to being shamed in front of a crowd. The preacher won't forget what I did." Hannah's fingers tightened on the edge of the table. "He's the one who should feel shame." "Some men don't." He pulled on his gloves, met her eyes. "Keep the door barred, Hannah." "I will." The hours passed quietly. She mended a tear in the curtain with a piece of thread she found in a small box, then swept the hearth. The chores steadied her nerves. By midday, she heard hoofbeats on the trail. One rider, not more. Her pulse jumped. She lifted the shotgun from its peg and waited. A knock sounded, firm but not harsh. "It's me," came Gideon's voice. Relief loosened her knees. She opened the door and let him in. His coat was dusted with snow, his beard rimed with ice. "You look like you fought winter itself," she said, half smiling. "Winter's stubborn, but I reckon I'm worse." He carried a rabbit and a small canvas bag. "Found something you ought to see." He dropped the bag on the table and unrolled its contents, a small tin box dented at the corner and tied with twine. "Was this yours?" Hannah's breath caught. "My trunk," she whispered. "I left it at the boarding house before everything." Someone tossed it behind the livery, half buried. Must have figured it wasn't worth keeping. Her hands trembled as she untied the twine. Inside lay a folded dress, a silver cross, and a stack of papers bound with ribbon. Among them was a sealed envelope, yellowed but intact. Across the top, written in her late father's hand, were the words, "Water claim, South Fork property." Her voice shook. "This is it. The contract Reverend Tomlin drew when I married Earl." Gideon frowned. "Let's have a look." He broke the seal and spread the paper flat under the lamplight. The words were plain. "Upon lawful issue from the union of Earl and Hannah McRae, all rights to the McRae water allotment shall transfer to the said Hannah McRae and her heirs." At the bottom was Reverend Tomlin's signature, witnessed and dated. "He made me sign this before the wedding," Hannah said softly. "Said it was a blessing, that the Lord's bounty would pass through fruitful hands. When I couldn't bear a child, he told the council the deed was void." Gideon's jaw tightened. "Ain't void, not unless the territorial clerk struck it from record." She shook her head. "He burned the copy my father kept." "Still doesn't change the truth." Gideon traced the official seal with a finger. "This is legal. Means that preacher's been stealing from your family for years." Hannah stared at the document, anger and disbelief warring inside her. "Why would he need our water? He already has everything." "Water's worth more than gold out here," Gideon said. "Control the spring and you own the land. Folks'll pay to live, pay to drink. Tomlin's been running a kingdom behind that pulpit." For a long while, neither spoke. The fire cracked. Outside, the wind carried the faint howl of a coyote. Finally, Hannah whispered, "My father trusted him." "Most did," Gideon said. "He preaches loud enough to drown out doubt." She folded her arms around herself, shivering despite the warmth. "What can we do? He's got the sheriff, the council, the town." "We wait," Gideon said. "Storm will break, snow will melt. Then we ride down with proof in hand and make our claim." Her eyes lifted to his. "He'll try to stop us." "Let him try." The words were quiet, but carried the weight of iron. Something in Hannah's chest eased for the first time since the whipping. She nodded. That night, while Gideon worked by the fire repairing a broken snare, Hannah sat at the table reading through the rest of the papers. Among them she found an old letter from her father, written months before his death. His handwriting was crooked from the tremor in his hands. "If this paper ever reaches you, child, remember that land is the Lord's first gift to man, and water his second. Guard both with grace, not greed." Tears blurred her sight. She folded the letter and placed it beside the Bible. "He wanted me to keep it safe," she murmured. "You will," Gideon said without looking up. "You're the kind that keeps promises." She smiled faintly. "And you?" "I break fewer than I used to." Later, as the wind settled, she sat near the hearth with her hands folded around the silver cross. "You live alone up here?" she asked. Been that way 6 winters, he said. No one comes? Trappers, once in a while. Soldiers sometimes. They keep their distance. Folks think I'm half wild. Are you? He gave a short laugh. Not enough to suit the wolves, too much to please the town. Seems a lonely place to be. He nodded toward her. You know something about that. Her throat tightened. I do. They fell silent again, the kind of silence that said more than talk could. The fire popped. Gideon laid aside his tools and leaned back in the chair. You get some rest, he said. Tomorrow we'll talk about how to keep that paper safe. Morning dawned clear and biting. Hannah rose before Gideon and brewed coffee. When he sat up, she handed him a mug. Thought you might like it hot for once, she said. He smiled behind the steam. I'd forgotten what kindness tastes like. They ate quietly. Cornbread, dried berries, a bit of smoked meat. Afterward, Gideon wrapped the water contract in oilcloth and slid it into a hollow beneath a loose floorboard. No safer place, he said. If someone finds the cabin, they won't find this. You think they'll come? She asked. I know men like Tomlin. He won't rest while someone holds proof of his lies. What will you do if they find us? He looked up, eyes steady. Protect you. The words were plain, but they struck deep. Hannah opened her mouth, closed it again, unsure what to say. No one had ever promised her that before, not her husband, not the preacher, not anyone. Afternoon light slanted through the window. Gideon spent the day sharpening tools and checking traps near the spring. Hannah sorted through her trunk, laying out small things she'd thought lost forever. Her mother's shawl, a needle case, a tin of buttons. Among them she found a small notebook filled with verses she'd written as a girl. Lines about rivers and faith and morning light. She smiled, remembering. By the time Gideon returned, dusk had settled. Tracks on the lower trail, he said. 3 horses. Could be hunters. Or them. Could be. He set down his pack. If they're coming, they'll wait for daylight. No man rides that path blind. Then we have till morning. Plenty of time to plan. He hung his rifle on the peg and sat at the table. We'll ride east at first light. Eunice, my sister, runs the mercantile in town. She can help us. Keeps good records. You trust her? With my life, he said simply. The night passed slow. Gideon dozed in his chair, rifle across his knees. Hannah slept fitfully, waking at each creak of the timbers. Once she heard faint hoofbeats far down the mountain. They came and went like a ghost sound. At dawn, Gideon touched her shoulder. Time. She dressed quickly, wincing as the bandage pulled. He saddled the horse and packed food and blankets. The hidden contract remained under the floorboard, wrapped tight. Gideon would return for it once they knew where they stood. The trail glittered under morning frost. Hannah rode behind him, arms around his waist, her cheek against the rough wool of his coat. The world stretched silent and endless ahead. For the first time since her father died, she felt she was moving toward something right. Far below, in Jericho Crossing, Reverend. Tomlin stared out the church window at the same rising sun. Earl McRae stood behind him, hat in hand. They'll come down, Tomlin said quietly. People always do. What if the mountain man talks? Earl asked. Tomlin's mouth curved into a thin smile. Then we'll see how quickly the righteous lose their tongues. He turned from the window, his eyes cold as the river ice. Bring my men. There's work to be done. By the time Gideon and Hannah reached the ridgeline, the day had turned gray and heavy again. Clouds pressed low, promising another storm. They made it back to the cabin just as the first flakes began to fall. Gideon closed the door behind them, bolted it, and shook the snow from his hat. "Storm's moving fast," he said. "We'll be snowed in for a spell." Hannah nodded, pulling her shawl tight. "Then it's a good thing you brought me here." He built the fire higher, filled the pot with snow, and set it on the iron grate to melt. "You'll want to rest. I'll check the line traps once it eases." "I'd rather help," she said quietly. "I can mend nets or sew patches if you've got torn gear." He looked up at her, surprised. "You sew?" "I was raised to keep things from wearing out too soon." He half smiled. "Then you'll fit right in. Nothing up here lasts long if you don't keep at it." The days fell into a steady rhythm. Mornings were for tending traps and melting snow for water. Afternoons, when the wind cut too fierce, were for small work indoors. Hannah mended socks and shirts, scrubbed pots, and learned to dry fish strips over the fire without scorching them. Gideon split wood, tanned hides, and checked the line for fox prints. He didn't talk much. When he did, his words were few but weighed with thought. Hannah learned his silences when they meant anger, when they meant peace. She could tell from the way he set his shoulders if he was remembering something painful. Sometimes she caught him staring out the window toward the distant valley, his expression far away. "Do you miss people?" she asked one afternoon as she basted a seam. He didn't turn. "Used to, not anymore." "Why not?" He took a long time before answering. "Folk got a way of proving the world right about them. I figured I'd just get out of its way." She didn't press him. But that night, when the wind moaned down from the peaks, she prayed silently that the Lord would show him that not all people were cruel. 3 nights later, the fire had burned low when Hannah woke to a sound. A low groan from Gideon's cot. The moonlight showed him thrashing in sleep, sweat on his brow. "No," he muttered, voice raw. "Not the child." She hesitated, then crossed the room and touched his arm. "Gideon, wake up. You're dreaming." He bolted upright, eyes wide, hand going for his knife. Then he saw her and froze. "It's all right," she said softly. "You were dreaming." He wiped his face, breathing hard. "Sorry." She waited, but he said nothing more. When he lay back down, she returned to her bed. Yet the words echoed in her mind. Not the child. By morning, the sky had cleared, but the air bit sharp. Gideon stepped outside to fetch wood, and Hannah followed to shake out blankets. As she spread them on the porch rail, she said quietly, "You called out in your sleep last night." He paused mid-step. "Did I?" "You said, 'Not the child'?" His shoulders stiffened. "Forget it." She hesitated, then said, "I once nursed a sick Apache boy. He couldn't have been more than 7. The soldiers came and took him from his mother's tent. I tried to hide him under a blanket, but he was too weak. He died 2 days later." Gideon's hand froze on the woodpile. The color drained from his face. "When was this?" he asked, voice low. 5 years ago, at San Miguel Crossing." He turned slowly. "That wasn't a raid, was it?" She met his eyes. "No. They were just trying to go home." The silence between them felt heavy as a grave. Gideon set the wood down, staring at his boots. "I was there," he said finally. "I was the scout who led them in." Her breath caught. "You?" He nodded once. "We were told it was a war band. They said children had been taken hostage. I believed them. When the smoke cleared, I saw the truth too late." He leaned against the porch post, hands trembling. "I've carried that boy's face in my head every day since." Hannah swallowed hard. The world felt still around them, snowflakes drifting slow in the morning light. "Then maybe it wasn't your hand that killed him," she said quietly. "Maybe it was the lies that sent you." He looked at her, surprised. You don't hate me for it? I hated enough in my life, she said. It never healed a thing. Gideon's throat worked. I don't know how to pray for forgiveness anymore. Then I'll pray for you, she said simply. That evening, when they sat at the table over bowls of rabbit stew, Gideon spoke again, voice rough. I thought God turned his face from me after that day. But you talk like he's still listening. He is, she said. Maybe he sent you to me to prove it. He looked down, shaking his head. Don't make me into something I ain't. I'm not, she replied. You're just a man trying to make right what's wrong. That's enough. Something in him eased then. He leaned back in his chair, the faintest smile tugging at his mouth. You're a stubborn woman, Hannah McRae. I've been called worse. They both laughed, softly, like people remembering what laughter felt like. Weeks passed. The storm season deepened. The cabin became their world, a little island of warmth in a sea of white. They worked side by side, rarely apart. Gideon taught her to snare snowshoe hares. She taught him to patch torn gloves. Some evenings, they read from the Bible together. Gideon's voice was halting, as though the words felt strange after years of silence. Hannah never corrected him. She simply listened, letting the sound of scripture settle between them. One night he read aloud from Isaiah, Though your sins be as scarlet, they shall be white as snow. He looked up, meeting her eyes. Think that's true? I know it is, she said. He nodded slowly. Then maybe there's hope for the likes of us yet. By mid-February, the snow began to soften. Patches of brown earth showed through on the southern slope. Gideon started talking about the valley again, about Eunice's store, about the way the aspens turned silver in spring. We'll go down when the pass clears, he said one afternoon, as they packed dried meat into sacks. File that water claim proper. Make sure Tomlin answers for what he's done. Hannah's heart quickened at the thought of facing the town, but she nodded. I won't run from truth anymore. That's courage, he said. It's faith, she replied. He smiled faintly. Maybe they're the same thing. Outside, the wind carried the scent of thawing pine. The mountain stood tall and quiet around them. For the first time since her father's death, Hannah felt that the world might forgive her for surviving. The thaw came slow, like an old man waking from sleep. The snow that had blanketed the pines for months now sagged in gray ridges. Icicles wept down the eaves of Gideon's cabin. Every day the creek below roared a little louder, eating its way through ice. Hannah stood on the porch, wrapped in Gideon's coat, breathing in the smell of damp earth and spruce. For the first time since the whipping, she could feel warmth in her skin. The sun touched her face without hurting. Inside, Gideon packed their winter tools, traps, skins, and the few goods worth trading. He moved slow, methodical, saying little. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of decisions made long before dawn. We'll head down when the river trail clears. 2, maybe 3 days' ride to Jericho. Hannah turned from the light. I reckon I'm ready. He studied her a moment. Sure of that. Ain't much mercy waiting down there. She lifted her chin. If I can face the lash, I can face them. He couldn't argue with that. Then we'll face them together. They spent that week preparing. Hannah mended the packs and line bags while Gideon checked the horses' shoes and gathered smoked meat for the road. He cut a walking stick from young oak and carved a cross at its handle. For you, he said, handing it to her. The trail's rough. She smiled. Looks more like a pilgrim's staff. Maybe that's what we are, he said. That night, as they ate by the fire, she asked, What will you do when this is over? He poked the coals with a stick. Don't rightly know. Ain't much waiting for me, but quiet. Maybe that's enough. Maybe not, she said softly. Sometimes quiet just means the story ain't finished. The morning they left, the air smelled of wet pine and thawing mud. Gideon saddled his horse and lashed the bedrolls tight. Hannah tucked the oil-wrapped contract into her satchel. The cabin door creaked behind them as they stepped out into a world reborn. They rode single file down the trail, snow hissing under the hooves. Meltwater trickled beside them like whispered prayer. By midday, they reached the lower ridge where the river ran free and fast. Gideon pointed to the peaks behind them. When we come back, the snows'll be gone. You sound sure we'll come back, Hannah said. I aim to build something worth returning to, he said, and nudged the horse forward. They made camp by the river that night, near a grove of cottonwoods. Gideon built a small fire from driftwood while Hannah boiled coffee in a dented pot. The smell carried through the dusk. Tell me about your sister, she said. Eunice? He smiled faintly. Stubborn as a mule, sharp as a hawk. Runs the Mercantile in Jericho. Folks trust her because she don't play favorites. She'll help us? She's the one person I never had to question. Hannah stirred the pot. And she knows about me? She knows I brought someone hurt out of the snow. That's all for now. We'll tell her the rest when we've got proof. Hannah nodded. I just hope seeing me doesn't put her in danger. She's tougher than you think. Don't worry. The river sang softly in the dark. For the first time since she'd left town, Hannah didn't fear the sound of running water. It reminded her of renewal, not shame. 2 days later, the lights of Jericho Crossing shimmered below them in the valley. Smoke rose from chimneys. Church bells tolled faintly in the distance, echoing across the thawed earth. Hannah's stomach twisted. Every board, every fence post carried the memory of her pain. Gideon reined in his horse. You sure you can ride in? I'm sure, she said, but I'll walk through on my own feet. He nodded. Then we go slow. Keep your head high. They followed the muddy road past the mill and down the main street. Townsfolk turned from their wagons and shop doors, whispering. Some froze in disbelief. Others crossed themselves. A child pointed and called, "It's the barren woman," before his mother yanked him inside. Hannah kept her eyes forward. Her cheeks burned, but her back stayed straight. When they reached the Mercantile, Gideon dismounted and helped her down. He rapped on the door twice. A woman's voice called, "We're closed till evening." "Eunice," Gideon said quietly. "It's me." The door flew open. Eunice Holt stood framed in lamplight, wiping her hands on her apron. She was tall, gray at the temples, with eyes that missed nothing. For a second, she stared at Gideon like she was seeing a ghost. Then she threw her arms around him. 6 years without a letter, and you show up with a woman at your side, she said, half laughing, half crying. You ornery fool, I thought you were bones up there. Missed you too, sister, he said, embarrassed but glad. Eunice turned to Hannah, taking her in quietly. The worn shawl, the pale scars peeking above the collar. And you must be the reason he came down from the clouds. Hannah bowed her head. My name's Hannah McRae. Eunice's brow furrowed. McRae, I heard what they did to you. Her voice dropped, fierce now. It was wicked. The Reverend's been running this town like a whip. That's why we're here, Gideon said. We've got proof he stole her father's water allotment. I need your help to set it right. Eunice's jaw tightened. You'll have it. Come in before someone sees you standing in the street. Inside, the Mercantile smelled of flour, kerosene, and leather. Barrels lined the walls. Ledgers lay open on the counter. Eunice locked the door and drew the curtains. Show me what you've got, she said. Hannah took the contract from her satchel and set it on the counter. Eunice read every line, lips moving silently. When she finished, she let out a long whistle. "He signed it himself. Fool man didn't even fake the seal." "He figured no one would ever see it again," Gideon said. Eunice crossed her arms. "The county clerk will honor this, if we get it in his hands. But Tomlin won't let you get that far. He owns the sheriff, the bank, and half the council." "Then we'll go straight to him first," Gideon said. "Call him out before the people." Eunice frowned. "You always did like your justice noisy." "Sometimes noise is the only way truth gets heard." Hannah looked between them. "If he tries to turn the town against us?" Eunice laid a hand over hers. "Then I'll be standing right beside you, child." That night, they ate supper in the back room. Salt pork, beans, and fresh bread. Outside, rain began to fall, washing the mud clean. Eunice filled them in on the months they'd missed. The new sawmill contract that funneled money through the church, the preacher's hold over the sheriff, the way widows had been taxed for moral upkeep. "It's gone too far," she said. "People are scared, but they're ready for someone to stand up. If you show that paper in front of them all, they might just remember their backbone." Gideon leaned back. "Then that's what we'll do." Hannah swallowed hard. "Tomorrow?" "Tomorrow," he said. Late that night, when the shop was dark and the town's lamps had burned low, Hannah couldn't sleep. She sat by the window watching the rain trace lines down the glass. Gideon sat across the room cleaning his rifle, the motion slow and thoughtful. "You ever wonder if some things can't be made right?" she asked. He looked up. "Every day." "And yet you still try." He set the rifle aside. "Trying's the only way a man stays human." She smiled faintly. "Then I reckon there's hope for us both." He nodded, and the quiet between them wasn't empty. It was full of something alive, fragile, and good. Outside, the storm washed the last of the snow from the valley. Morning would bring clear skies, and with them, judgment. The next morning broke clean and pale, sunlight spilling over the wet rooftops of Jericho Crossing. The air smelled of damp earth and smoke, and the mountains behind the town shimmered with melting snow. Gideon tightened the saddle cinch and looked toward the church steeple piercing the blue. "Time to end what started in that street," he said quietly. Hannah's heart thudded. She smoothed her skirt and adjusted her shawl. "I'm not afraid," she whispered, though her hands trembled as she spoke. Eunice stepped out from the mercantile, coat buttoned against the morning chill. "The council's meeting in the church," she said. "Tomlin's likely planning to make an example of you again, but this time he won't hold the whip." Gideon nodded. "Let him try his sermon on me." The three of them started up the muddy street. Every face they passed turned to watch. Women paused in their doorways. Ranch hands leaned on their shovels. Whispers rippled like wind over wheat. Hannah kept her head high, every step a defiance of the shame they'd once hung on her name. When they reached the church, the bell tolled once, a slow, heavy sound. Inside, the pews were half filled with townsfolk. Reverend Tomlin stood near the pulpit, robes crisp, his gold-ringed fingers glinting in the light from the tall windows. He looked up, eyes narrowing when he saw Gideon and Hannah at the door. "You're not welcome here," he said coldly. "We've business, Reverend," Gideon said, voice steady. "Town business. Best you let us speak." "This is God's house," Tomlin barked. "Not a stable for vagrants?" "Then why is it full of lies?" Gideon asked. A murmur swept through the room. Eunice slipped into a side pew, quietly handing papers to two ranchers she trusted. Hannah walked forward, each step echoing on the wooden floor. When she reached the pulpit, she turned to face the crowd. "You all saw me whipped here," she said, voice clear. "You were told it was for sin, but it wasn't sin, it was theft." The congregation stirred. Tomlin lifted a hand as if to silence her, but she went on. "This paper," she said, drawing the folded contract from her satchel, "proves Reverend Tomlin stole my father's water rights. He forged his own blessing into a curse to rob the weak." Gideon placed the contract on the pulpit and unfolded it. Gasps rippled through the church. Tomlin's signature shone dark against the parchment. Tomlin's mask slipped. "Those are lies," he thundered. "A desperate woman's tricks." "Then explain the county seal," Eunice said from the pew, holding up a copy of an old ledger page she'd brought from the Mercantile. "And explain the coin accounts that match the same dates. I keep clean books, Reverend. Can you say the same?" Murmurs grew louder. Men shifted uneasily. Sheriff Dillard, standing near the door, looked between them all, sweat beading on his temple. Tomlin stepped down from the pulpit, voice rising. "You dare defy the word of God. This woman was struck barren for her wickedness." Hannah cut him off. "God didn't curse me. Men did. You did." The room fell silent. Even the bell outside seemed to stop its toll. Gideon moved beside her. "You've used his name to cover your greed," he said, "but your time's done." Tomlin's eyes darted to the back of the room where two of his hired riders stood. "Take them," he barked. The men hesitated. Gideon's hand dropped to the handle of his rifle, but he didn't raise it. "No need for shooting," he said. "Let the truth speak." One of the riders looked to the sheriff. Dillard swallowed and shook his head slowly. "Reverend, I reckon you've said enough. The town's seen your books." The Reverend's face turned red. "You'll regret this," he hissed. "All of you." But his voice cracked. The authority that had once wrapped him like a cloak was slipping away thread by thread. Hannah stepped forward, standing inches from him. "You whipped me for not bearing fruit," she said softly. "Yet I stand before you now, carrying truth that will feed this whole town." Tomlin backed away, cornered between pulpit and wall. His eyes darted like a trapped animal's. "You think these people will follow a ruined woman and a murderer?" Gideon's gaze darkened. "Maybe," he said, "because they've had enough of both kinds of men you've been." Outside, the crowd that had gathered spilled into the churchyard. Word spread fast through Jericho Crossing. The preacher was exposed. Some laughed, some cried. Others simply stood still, as if the spell over them had broken, and they were seeing daylight for the first time. Eunice helped Hannah down the steps while Gideon stayed close behind. The sheriff followed, holding the signed papers like a holy relic. "We'll take these to the clerk," he said quietly. "He'll honor them." Tomlin burst from the doors a moment later, shouting curses, but no one moved to stop the others. A woman in the crowd spat at his feet. "You called us sinners," she said, "but it's you who's rotten." The preacher stumbled away toward the parsonage, his voice swallowed by the sound of church bells and rushing water from the river swollen with thaw. By sundown, the town felt changed. The saloon stood quiet. Even the dogs lay calm in the street. In the back room of the Mercantile, Gideon sat with Hannah and Eunice over coffee. "You did what no man in that town ever dared," Eunice said. "You faced him where he was strongest." Hannah shook her head. "It wasn't me alone. Truth has its own strength." Gideon looked at her, admiration plain in his eyes. "You found your voice, Hannah. The same one they tried to beat out of you." "I found it because someone believed I still had one," she said gently. He didn't answer, but his eyes softened. Outside, the last of the day's light lingered on the snowmelt running down the gutter. Gideon rose, pulling on his coat. "Tomorrow we'll take the papers to the county clerk. By law, the water's yours again." Eunice smiled. Maybe we'll rename that spring for something better than McRae Creek, something folks will remember. Hannah thought for a moment. Then call it Hope's Well, she said. Eunice nodded. Hope's Well it is. As the sisters cleared the cups, Gideon stepped out into the cool evening. The town was quiet now, humbled, cleansed. He looked toward the mountain where his cabin waited, smoke long gone from its chimney. For the first time in years, he didn't feel alone. That night, rain began to fall again, steady, washing the mud clean. Hannah stood by the window, watching the droplets race down the glass. In the reflection, she saw Gideon's shape behind her. You think they'll let us be? She asked. Maybe not, he said. But whatever comes next, we'll meet it on our feet. She nodded. Together. He took her hand, rough and warm. Together, he repeated. Outside, the bell of Jericho Crossing tolled once more. Not a warning this time, but a beginning. Sunday dawned bright, but the light felt sharp as broken glass. Bells rang from the church tower, calling Jericho Crossing to worship. By mid-morning, wagons lined the street, and townsfolk filed toward the building in their best coats, heads full of gossip about the mountain man and the barren woman who had dared to face their preacher. Inside, candles flickered on the altar. The pews filled one by one until the air hummed with tension. Reverend Tomlin stood at the pulpit in a spotless robe, his face pale but composed. When he spread his arms, the congregation fell silent. Brothers and sisters, he began, voice smooth as butter, sin breeds confusion among the weak. The enemy walks in our midst, disguised as righteousness. He whispers in the ears of fallen women and draws godless men down from their caves. Hannah sat in the third pew beside Gideon and Eunice. Every word dripped poison. The Reverend's eyes kept darting toward her, but she did not flinch. He continued, louder now. This town's peace has been disturbed by false testimony, forged papers, blasphemous accusations. Yet our Lord teaches mercy to those who repent. A murmur rippled through the room. Gideon's jaw tightened. Eunice leaned over and whispered, He's turning the story, making you the sinner again. I expected he would, Hannah said, softly. But truth doesn't fear his voice. Tomlin raised a hand. Let us pray for the deceived. Let us offer them redemption before their judgment is sealed. Hannah rose before he could begin his next word. Her chair scraped loud against the floor, drawing every eye. I don't need your redemption, she said clearly. The Lord already gave me his mercy, without your permission. Gasps swept the pews. Tomlin's smile wavered. Sit down, child. Pride is a serpent that— No, Reverend, she said, stepping into the aisle. You taught this town that God's grace must be earned, but that was never true. You took my father's water and called it his will. You made me a spectacle to hide your theft. Eunice stood, voice sharp as a whip. And we've proof of it still. She held up the clerk's stamped document she'd carried since the day before. The seal glinted gold in the candlelight. Tomlin's eyes flashed with fury. You dare bring worldly law into God's house? Gideon stepped forward then, tall and steady as a pine. This ain't your house, preacher. It's the Lord's, same as the land and water you stole. The crowd stirred, divided. Some shouted for Tomlin, others for truth. A baby cried somewhere in the back. The air felt thick as smoke. Tomlin slammed his palm on the pulpit. You fools! You follow a murderer and a barren sinner. You think they'll save your souls? Gideon's voice cut through the noise like a clean blade. Maybe they'll remind you you've still got one. Tomlin's lips twisted. You think you're self-righteous because you carry a gun? No, Gideon said. Because I laid it down. For a heartbeat, the church was silent except for the creak of the pews. Then Hannah lifted her chin. We came not to fight, but to speak truth. If mercy has no home in this church, we'll take it outside where the Lord can see it plain." She turned and walked toward the door. Gideon followed, his boots echoing behind hers. The congregation hesitated, torn between fear and faith. Then one old woman, Mrs. Calder, who had lost her farm to Tomlin's donations, stood up and said, "I'm done listening to that man." She shuffled after Hannah. Another man followed, then another. Within minutes, half the church emptied into the sunlight. Tomlin's voice rose, desperate now. "Leave if you must, but you'll regret defying your shepherd." Eunice lingered at the doorway and said, "A shepherd protects his flock. You've been bleeding yours dry." Then she stepped out, slamming the door behind her. Outside, the gathered townsfolk stood uncertain in the dusty street. Hannah turned to them, face pale but calm. "You all know what he's done. You've seen it. But this town can be better than fear. It can be free." The crowd murmured in agreement. Gideon laid a steady hand on her shoulder, pride shining quietly in his eyes. Inside the church, Tomlin stood alone before the altar. He stared down at the papers on his pulpit, the contract, the ledgers Eunice had presented. His hands shook. From outside came the sound of many voices, joining in a hymn someone had started. It was the first time in years Jericho Crossing had sung without his lead. Tomlin sank into the front pew, breath ragged. In his mind, the bell's toll sounded less like triumph and more like warning. By afternoon, the whole town buzzed. The sheriff posted a notice declaring an investigation into Tomlin's dealings with the church funds. The mercantile filled with people offering to help rebuild what greed had broken. Gideon repaired a wagon axle, while Hannah spoke softly with widows who had lost their land. She promised that once the deed was honored, the water from her spring would be shared freely. "No one should thirst where there's mercy to give," she said. That evening, as sunset poured gold across the valley, Gideon and Hannah walked to the edge of the creek. The water ran high and bright, freed from the ice that had trapped it all winter. Hannah knelt, dipped her hand into the flow, and let the cold run through her fingers. "This is what he tried to own," she said. Gideon crouched beside her. "Can't own what was made by God." "Then maybe it's time we give it back to him," she said. He smiled faintly. "That sounds like something worth fighting for." Behind them, the bells began to ring again, this time not for worship, but for change. Hannah looked at the sky, pink and clear, and whispered, "It's not over yet." "No," Gideon said, "but the tide's turned." Morning came with the smell of rain on dust and the sound of wagons creaking to life. Jericho Crossing buzzed like a stirred hive. The council had ordered Reverend Tomlin's accounts seized, and Sheriff Dillard, pale but resolute, was carrying out the law. Folks whispered that justice had finally come down from the mountains, but not everyone believed it. Gideon sensed trouble before they even stepped into the street. He checked the cinch on his horse twice and kept the rifle close at hand. "Too quiet," he muttered. "When a liar's cornered, he doesn't pray, he bites." Hannah joined him, holding her shawl against the breeze. "You think he'll run?" "Men like Tomlin don't run. They scheme." Eunice handed Gideon a packet of bread and jerky for the road. "The clerk's expecting you by noon," she said. "Once those papers are signed, the water's legally yours." Gideon nodded, but his eyes kept scanning the rooftops. He'd learned long ago that victory was the moment a man's guard dropped, and that was when death liked to strike. They rode out together, Gideon, Hannah, and Eunice, following the river road toward the county office 2 miles east. The sky was a hard, washed-out blue. Mud clung to the horses' hooves. Halfway across the flats, Gideon reined in suddenly. Hear that? Hannah frowned. I don't hear anything. Exactly. The world had gone still. No birds, no breeze, just the soft creak of saddle leather. He turned in the saddle, eyes narrowing toward a bluff of rocks ahead. The angle was perfect for an ambush. Get down, he said quietly. Hannah slid from the horse just as the first shot cracked through the air. The bullet whined past her head and buried itself in a tree trunk. Gideon swung his rifle up and fired once toward the rocks. Stay low, he shouted. Another shot rang out, striking the saddle horn. The horse reared, screaming. Eunice scrambled for cover behind a fallen log, clutching her satchel. They're on both sides. Ride back if you can, Gideon yelled. Go now! But she refused to leave. Not without you. 3 riders emerged from the bluff, guns flashing. Gideon recognized them. Tomlin's hired hands, the same who'd whipped Hannah under the Reverend's orders. End of the road, mountain man, one called, grinning through a tobacco-stained beard. Not yet, Gideon muttered. He fired again, dropping the lead horse. The man tumbled into the mud, cursing. Gideon ducked as another shot splintered the log beside him. Pain burned across his side, a grazing hit, but deep enough to draw blood. Hannah saw him stumble. Gideon! Stay back, he gasped, pressing a hand to the wound. Don't! Before he could finish, a 4th gunman stepped from the trees behind her. Drop it, girl, he sneered, raising his revolver. Hannah froze. Looks like the preacher was right, the man said. You do bring trouble. She lifted her hands slowly, heart pounding. You don't have to do this. He smirked. Lady, I ain't the one that has to. A rifle cracked. The man jerked backward and fell without a sound. Gideon lowered the barrel, smoke drifting from the muzzle. No one touches her, he growled. The others fled when they saw their comrade fall. Gideon staggered after them, but his strength failed. He dropped to one knee, blood seeping through his coat. Gideon! Hannah ran to him, kneeling in the mud. You're hit bad. He tried to speak, but his voice came out a whisper. Just a scratch. Don't lie to me, she said fiercely. She tore a strip from her shawl and pressed it to the wound. Stay still. Eunice crouched beside them, trembling. We've got to get him back to town. No, Gideon rasped. They'll be waiting on the road. You take the papers. Get them to the clerk. Don't stop till it's done. I'm not leaving you, Hannah said. You have to. This is what we came for. She shook her head, tears streaking her cheeks. I can't lose another soul to that man's hatred. He managed a faint smile. You won't. I've survived worse. But when his eyes rolled back, she realized he'd slipped into unconsciousness. By nightfall, they had dragged him into a hunting shack near the creek, its roof half collapsed but still offering shelter. Rain poured outside, washing blood and mud into the river. Eunice built a small fire while Hannah cleaned the wound. Gideon stirred once, groaning. Hold still, she whispered. You're safe. You hear me? Safe. He grunted in reply, drifting in and out of fevered sleep. Eunice touched her shoulder. You did what you could. He needs a doctor. There's none closer than the fort, Hannah said, shaking her head. We can't move him. Lightning flashed, followed by thunder. The little room filled with cold light. Hannah knelt beside the cot, her hands clasped. Lord, she prayed softly, you spared him once for a reason. Don't let that reason die here. The storm roared on, drowning her words. At dawn, the rain stopped. Smoke rose from the chimney of the distant parsonage, Tomlin's house. He was preparing something, she could feel it. Eunice packed her bag. I'll ride to the clerk. He needs that deed today, or the Reverend will twist the law again. Hannah nodded. Go, I'll stay with him. You sure? He saved me. I'll do the same. Eunice hesitated, then hugged her tight. You've got more courage than this whole town put together. As she rode off down the trail, Hannah turned back to Gideon. His skin burned hot. She dipped a rag in cool water and laid it on his forehead. "You told me not to be afraid," she whispered. "Now you keep that promise, too." Outside, the morning sun broke through the clouds, shining on the soaked earth and the muddy trail where Eunice's horse disappeared toward Jericho. Far away, in the church, Reverend Tomlin stood before the mirror in his study. His hands shook as he tied his collar. "If they won't believe my word," he murmured, "then they'll fear my judgment." He opened a drawer and drew out a pistol, small, silver, and perfectly polished. "Mercy," he said, looking at his reflection, "is for the guilty who repent, not for the proud who defy the Lord." He turned towards the door, coat swirling behind him. The bells began to toll again, calling the people to a final reckoning. Rain had stopped by the time the sun rose over Jericho Crossing, but the town still smelled of thunder, wet dust, burned powder, and fear. Reverend Tomlin moved through the church with slow, deliberate steps, his boots echoing off the plank floor. The pews stood empty now, the air thick with the scent of candle smoke and damp hymnals. He paused by the window, watching riders gallop down the main road, carrying word that the sheriff had seized his ledgers. His jaw clenched. "Fools," he muttered. "They think a paper can undo the will of God." Across town, Hannah sat beside Gideon's cot in the abandoned shack, exhaustion painted across her face. He slept fitfully, his breath shallow, skin pale beneath the rough bandage she had changed through the night. When the creek outside whispered under the wind, she closed her eyes and prayed, quietly, steadily. "Lord, don't let him go yet. Not until he sees the mercy you meant for him." But mercy rarely came without trial. Eunice burst through the door at noon, her face streaked with mud. "The clerk took the deed," she gasped. "It's signed, stamped, and filed. Hannah, it's yours now." Relief flooded Hannah's chest. Then dread followed close behind. "Then Tomlin will know he's lost everything." Eunice nodded grimly. "He already does. He's calling a gathering tonight. Says he'll cleanse sin from the valley once and for all. He means you, child." "I can't leave him," Hannah said, glancing at Gideon's still body. Eunice gripped her shoulders. "You can't save him if you're taken. He wouldn't forgive me if I let that happen." Hannah's lips trembled. "Where would I go?" Eunice thought for a moment. "There's an old root cellar behind the store. You can hide there till he's strong enough to ride." But before they could move, hoofbeats thundered up the trail outside. Voices shouted, hard, angry voices. Eunice's eyes widened. "They found us." The door flew open. 2 of Tomlin's men stormed in, rifles drawn. "By order of Reverend Tomlin," one barked. "The woman's to stand before the congregation tonight." Eunice stepped between them and Hannah. "You lay a hand on her and you'll answer to the sheriff." The man sneered. "Sheriff won't help. The Reverend's got him locked in his own jail." Hannah rose slowly, steadying herself. "I'll go," she said, "but you'll let her stay. She's done no harm." "Hannah, no." Eunice started, but Hannah shook her head. "Gideon needs you more than I do," she whispered. "If I run, he'll only come after me. But if I face Tomlin, maybe it ends." Eunice's throat tightened, but she knew there was no stopping her. "God keep you, child." As the men dragged Hannah toward the waiting wagon, she cast one last glance back. Gideon stirred, muttering her name in his fever. The sound tore her heart in two. Jericho Crossing gathered that evening under torchlight. The church bell tolled slow and heavy, its sound rolling through the wet air like warning. Hannah stood bound at the front steps, her hands tied before her, hair clinging to her face in the rain. Reverend Tomlin loomed behind her, his Bible in one hand, the the small silver pistol hidden in the folds of his robe. "Behold the fruit of rebellion," he cried to the crowd. "A woman who defied God's chosen messenger. She brought ruin upon this town, turned brother against brother. But the Lord is merciful. He grants her a chance to confess." No one spoke. The people of Jericho looked on, some fearful, some ashamed. A few turned away. Hannah lifted her head. "The Lord you speak of doesn't demand confession for your crimes, Reverend. Only repentance." Tomlin's face twisted. "Blasphemy!" He raised his hand, striking her across the cheek. "You still dare defy holy order?" Her voice trembled, but did not break. "I defy cruelty that hides behind his name." A hush fell over the crowd. Even those who had believed in him now looked uneasy. Back at the shack, Gideon awoke with a start, drenched in sweat. The fever had broken, leaving him weak but clear-headed. He reached for his rifle and found it missing. The fire was cold. The room was empty, except for the faint scent of rain and the echo of her voice in his mind. "Don't let him go yet, Lord." He swung his legs over the cot, wincing at the pain in his side. Outside, the sky glowed with torchlight from the valley. He knew that glow. He'd seen it once before, when a camp burned. "Not again," he muttered. Stumbling to his feet, he tore a strip from his coat, wrapped it around the wound, and staggered toward his horse. Every step felt like walking through fire. But he mounted, gritting his teeth, and urged the animal forward. In town, Reverend Tomlin's voice rose to a fever pitch. "Tonight, Jericho cleanses itself. The Lord's wrath will fall upon the wicked." He drew the silver pistol from his robe. Gasps rippled through the crowd. "No more lies," he said, leveling it at Hannah. "No more thieves of holiness." Before he could pull the trigger, a gunshot cracked through the night, not from Tomlin but from the shadows at the edge of the crowd. His pistol flew from his hand and clattered across the steps. Gideon rode into the torchlight, rifle smoking, face pale and fierce. "That's enough preaching, Reverend," he said. The people scattered, stunned. Hannah's heart leapt. "Gideon!" He dismounted unsteadily, still bleeding, and climbed the steps. Tomlin backed away, clutching his injured hand. "You can't stop the Lord's judgment." Gideon's voice was steady, though his knees shook. "Ain't his judgment I'm worried about. It's yours." The sheriff, freed by townsmen who'd turned against Tomlin, pushed through the crowd. "Drop the weapon, Reverend. It's over." Tomlin's face twisted, and he lunged for the fallen pistol. But Gideon was faster. He kicked it aside and caught the preacher by the collar. "You whipped her in God's name. You stole land from widows. You called it holy." Tomlin spat. "You're no better. You killed children." Gideon froze, but Hannah stepped forward. "He already confessed that sin and sought forgiveness. You've hidden yours under the altar." Her words broke whatever hold the Reverend had left. He sagged, trembling. "You'll see," he whispered. "You'll all see." The sheriff cuffed him, dragging him down the steps as the townsfolk watched. Rain began again, soft, cleansing, unending. Hannah turned to Gideon, tears mingling with the drops on her face. "You came back?" He smiled weakly. "Told you I don't break promises." Then he collapsed into her arms. Rain drummed steady on the roof of the jailhouse as dusk fell over Jericho Crossing. Inside, the lamps burned low, throwing soft amber light across the worn plank floor. Reverend Tomlin sat in the cell at the far end, hands bound, lips moving in silent prayer. Or maybe curses. No one could tell. Outside, the townsfolk gathered under awnings, still whispering about what they'd seen. A mountain man bleeding but unbroken, a woman who'd faced down a preacher and lived, and a town learning what truth sounded like after years of lies. The wind carried their murmurs down the muddy street, through the open door of the Mercantile, and into the small room where Hannah knelt beside Gideon Holt's cot. He lay half-propped on a pillow, skin pale but breathing steady. Every so often he stirred, muttering her name. She pressed a cool cloth to his forehead and said softly, "You rest now. The worst is past." Across the room, Eunice sat mending a tear in his coat. The rhythmic pull of the needle filled the quiet. "You've done more for him than most doctors could," she said without looking up. Hannah smiled faintly. "Maybe, but it was God who kept him breathing." Eunice nodded. "Aye, sometimes he uses stubborn women to do his work." The door creaked open, and Sheriff Dillard stepped inside, hat in hand. "He's locked up good," he said. "Preachers raving about signs and judgments. Claims the Lord'll strike this town for turning against him." Hannah rose, wiping her hands on her apron. "He can rant all he wants. Truth's caught up with him now." The sheriff sighed. "Still, he's dangerous cornered. I'll keep the watch till morning." "Thank you, Sheriff," she said kindly. "You've done right." Dillard nodded, then lingered by Gideon's cot. "Never thought I'd see the day that fella from the mountains would save us all from a preacher." Eunice smiled. "God writes strange stories." "That he does," the sheriff said, tipping his hat before leaving them to the flicker of lamplight and rain. Night deepened. Outside, the storm rolled back over the valley, thunder echoing like a slow drum. Hannah kept her vigil, listening to Gideon's breath and the hiss of rain on the windows. When his eyes opened, she nearly cried from relief. "Where?" he whispered. "In the Mercantile," she said, leaning close. "You're safe." He blinked, trying to focus. "The preacher?" "In the jail where he belongs." He exhaled shakily. "You did it then. You faced him." "We did," she corrected. "You and me both." A faint smile touched his lips. "Reckon I'll have to stay alive then. Can't have you doing all the work." Her throat tightened. "You'd better. There's still fences to mend and water to share." He squeezed her hand weakly. "You really mean to give it away?" "Of course," she said. "It's not mine alone. It was meant for all." "Your father'd be proud." She looked down at his hand, calloused, scarred, strong even now, and whispered, "So would yours." The night stretched long. Gideon drifted in and out of sleep, and Hannah prayed by the window. The candle beside her guttered low, its flame flickering in the draft. She could see the jailhouse from there, the lamplight glowing dim behind the bars. Tomlin's shadow moved across the window once, pacing like a caged wolf. Hannah bowed her head and whispered, "Lord, even for him, have mercy." The words surprised her, but they were true. For the first time, she pitied the man. When dawn touched the horizon, the rain finally stopped. The first light spilled across the muddy street, glinting off puddles like silver coins. Gideon stirred and opened his eyes again. "Morning," he murmured. "Yes," she said, smiling. "You made it through the night." "Didn't do it alone." "No one ever does," she said. Later that morning, Sheriff Dillard came back to the Mercantile, breathless and pale. "The Reverend's gone," he said. "Cell door was open. Keys were gone too." Eunice gasped. "You mean he escaped?" "Looks that way. Took my horse by the tracks." Hannah's heart leapt to her throat. "Which way?" "South, toward the river. He won't get far, not with the storm flooding the low trail." But Hannah knew better. "He's headed for the spring," she said. "He'll try to poison what he can't own." Gideon struggled to sit up. "Then I'm going after him." "You're too weak," she said firmly. "Maybe. But he won't stop till he ruins what's left. Help me up." Seeing the fire in his eyes, she didn't argue. Together with Eunice's help, they got him to his feet, His wound bled fresh, but he ignored it. By midday, they reached the hills overlooking the spring. The thawed creek glimmered below, its banks swollen with rainwater. And there, kneeling by the edge, was Reverend Tomlin, mud-stained, coat torn, his reflection shivering in the current. "Don't do it, Cyrus," Gideon called, voice echoing across the water. "Let it go." Tomlin turned, eyes wild. "You think I'll let that woman own what's mine? I built this town. I made them believe." "You made them afraid," Gideon said. "That ain't the same." The preacher raised his pistol, but his hands trembled too hard to aim. "God's wrath is mine to deliver." "No, Reverend," Hannah said, stepping forward. "God's mercy is, and you've run from it too long." Her voice stopped him. He stared at her, shoulders shaking, the pistol lowering inch by inch. For the first time, his face crumpled, not in anger, but in something like despair. "What have I done?" he whispered. "What we all do," she said softly. "We forget that grace isn't ours to give or keep." Tomlin's knees buckled. The pistol slipped from his hand and splashed into the creek. He fell, forward, sobbing. "I wanted to be righteous," he said. "Then start by being forgiven," she replied. By the time the sheriff's posse arrived, Tomlin was on his knees, wrists bound, eyes empty but calm. The storm clouds had broken apart, sunlight spilling down in bright shafts across the valley. Hannah knelt by the water and washed the mud from her hands. Gideon stood beside her, pale but upright. "It's done," he said quietly. She looked at the rippling surface, at their reflections side by side. "Not done," she said. "Just beginning." He nodded. "Then let's begin right." As they walked back toward town, the church bell rang again. Slow, measured, not for judgment this time, but for renewal. The valley air carried the scent of wet earth and pine, and Hannah thought of her father's words. "Land is the Lord's first gift to man, and water his second." She reached for Gideon's hand. He didn't resist. Above them the sunlight touched the peaks, turning the snow to gold. Jericho Crossing had survived its long night of faith, and at last morning had come. Easter morning dawned bright and clear, the sky washed clean after weeks of storm. Bells rang from the church tower, their sound drifting across the reborn valley. Folks from every homestead gathered on the hillside near the spring, once called McRae Creek, now named Hope's Well. The air smelled of new grass and wild mint, and children laughed as they ran barefoot near the water. Gideon stood at the edge of the crowd, still pale from his wound, but upright and steady. Beside him, Hannah wore her mother's shawl, sunlight turning the fringe gold. When she looked around, she hardly recognized the town, no longer bowed by fear, but lifted by something stronger. Sheriff Dillard led the people in prayer, his voice trembling with gratitude. "We were blind," he said, "but the Lord sent mercy to open our eyes." He nodded toward Hannah. Through her courage, truth found its place again. Hannah stepped forward, dipping a wooden cup into the clear spring. "This water belongs to all," she said softly. "May it remind us that grace, once given, flows forever." Eunice smiled, and Gideon took Hannah's hand. The crowd began to sing, an old hymn rising into the blue morning air. Even the mountains seemed to listen. When the song ended, Gideon whispered, "You saved them." She shook her head. "No, Gideon. We saved each other." Above them the church bell rang once more, not for warning or judgment, but for peace. The afternoon sun poured through the open church doors, bright and pure, as if heaven itself was watching. Reverend Tomlin stood before the judge's table, his robes gone, wrists bound with rough rope. The townsfolk crowded inside, faces solemn but calm. Sheriff Dillard read the charges: fraud, theft, and abuse under false faith. Each word struck like a hammer on stone. Tomlin tried to speak, his voice breaking. "I only wanted righteousness," he said, trembling. "I served the Lord." "You served yourself," the sheriff replied quietly, "and hurt those who trusted you most." The courtroom fell silent. Hannah stepped forward, holding the water deed. Her hands didn't shake. "This paper doesn't belong to me," she said. "It belongs to every soul who's thirsted under his rule. I forgive him, but forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting." The judge nodded, eyes wet. "Let justice and mercy both stand." When the verdict came, guilty, no one cheered. They only bowed their heads in prayer. Outside, Gideon waited by the hitching post, sunlight warm on his shoulders. Hannah joined him, and he reached for her hand. "It's over," he said. She smiled. "No, Gideon, it's just begun." The church bell rang again, and for the first time its sound felt clean. Spring sunlight poured over Jericho Crossing, glinting off the steady flow of the creek newly christened Hope's Well. Wildflowers bloomed along its banks where once there had been only dust. Children splashed barefoot in the shallows, and women filled buckets, laughing freely for the first time in years. The town had changed, not through law or punishment, but through mercy. Gideon worked beside the others, repairing the fence near the water. His wound had healed, leaving only a scar that ached when the wind turned cold. When Hannah approached with a basket of bread, he straightened, wiping sweat from his brow. "Didn't think I'd see this place alive again," he said. "You helped bring it back," she replied, handing him a piece. Eunice stood nearby, reading from a small wooden sign newly staked into the ground. "The Well of Hannah's Hope, all welcome." The words made Hannah's eyes sting. Later, as evening fell, the people gathered by the water to pray. Gideon's voice joined theirs, low and sure, no longer ashamed to speak God's name aloud. When the prayer ended, he looked to Hannah. "You reckon the Lord's finished with us?" She smiled. "No, Gideon. I think he's just getting started." Summer came gentle to the valley, softening the mountains and warming the meadows where wildflowers swayed in the breeze. Hope's Well shimmered beneath the afternoon sun, clear as glass and cool as truth. The whole town gathered for a baptism, its first since the dark winter that had nearly broken them. Families lined the creek, faces bright with peace. Laughter mingled with the sound of running water, and the scent of fresh bread and pine filled the air. Hannah stood by the edge, skirts gathered in her hands, smiling at the children splashing in the shallows. Gideon stood beside her, clean-shaven and strong again, his scar fading to a pale reminder of what mercy had cost him. "Never thought I'd see the day," he said softly. "You lived to build it," she answered. Sheriff Dillard stepped forward, reading a verse about forgiveness and renewal. Then a young girl, little Ruthie, the orphan who'd hidden Hannah's deed, stepped into the creek. Hannah held her hand, whispering a prayer as the child bowed beneath the water. When Ruthie rose, the crowd cheered. "You're born new," Hannah said through tears. Gideon watched, his throat tight. "That's what you did for me," he said. "You washed the ruin off my soul." Hannah looked up at him. "No, Gideon, the Lord did that. I just believed you still had one worth saving." He reached for her hand, his rough fingers brushing hers with quiet reverence. "Then maybe he sent you to remind me." The people sang a hymn that carried across the valley. Even the mountains seemed to echo it back. As the sun dipped low, Hannah turned to the gathered crowd. "This well will never run dry," she said, "not while kindness flows from one heart to another." Gideon slipped his arm around her shoulders. "Then let's keep it flowing," he murmured. The bell from the new church rang clear in the twilight, a promise that Jericho Crossing had learned its greatest lesson, that mercy, once made flesh, could change even the hardest hearts. Thanks for tuning in. These stories remind us that life is more than headlines. It's about heartlines. Subscribe if you want more moments that make you pause, feel, and reflect.